we malign the concept of processed foods, but sometimes a bit of minimally invasive human processing in
Hmm.
a way that's been done like this for thousands of years is actually a really good idea.
Yeah, so tell me about that in the context of cacao. So for people who don't know, if you were wandering through a jungle and you saw a cacao tree, what you'd see is what I would describe as lava-colored dinosaur eggs is how they
Yeah.
look to me, kind of like
Yeah.
in the shape of a football. And if you were to open up that pod, you'd find this strange something that looks like out of an alien movie, these little white eggs, which is the cacao fruit. And then inside of that, you have a little, what, jelly bean, almond-sized bean, and that is the actual cacao that chocolate is made from. So, in your knowledge of this, which I'm sure you have quite a bit, how did people start taking that and turning it into what we now know as chocolate? Because there are quite a few steps involved.
Traditional consumption of this we trace back to traditional Aztec times when they were taking these beans, they were fermenting them, sometimes roasting them, and then pulverizing them and blending them into a sort of a very strong hot chocolate type of drink. Often other kind of spices and things of that nature added in there.
Mhm. And
And
not necessarily sweet, right? That's a newer addition.
correct, yeah, the sweetness is a more of a newer addition, although it can be somewhat traced back to the fact that fruit
Hmm.
that the fruit pulp that's on the outside of the cacao bean, which just for clarification for everybody is not technically a bean, it's actually a seed, but
Okay,
somehow it picked up the name bean along the way because
got it.
size
Good
and
to
shape,
know.
I suppose. That fruit is sweet, and so there is kind of a pre-written concept there in nature that that bitter and that sweet together make something special.
Hmm.
But that fruit pulp is generally fermented away, and then it was more a European innovation, actually, the making of chocolate. So
Okay.
what happens is the cacao beans first get peeled. You have the skin that comes off, and then they're gently pressed just with enough pressure to break up that bean into nibs. And so if you're buying cacao nibs, that's what that is. Then the nibs are slowly stone ground into a paste. And then from that point, you have cacao paste, and that's basically like taking, say, almonds and turning it into almond butter. It's basically a nut butter of cacao. And then from there, it can be pressed. And out one end of the machine, basically, you get cacao butter, and out the other end, you get cacao powder. For the way that most chocolate is made, it's taking cacao paste and adding a little bit of extra cacao butter to it. And that combination then gets mixed with whatever other ingredients you're using. In the more mainstream case, you would add like a milk powder and some stabilizers and GMO soy lecithin, and there's various other nefarious sugar or
Some corn syrup,
some
just for
corn.
good
Right,
measure.
right. It's some funky stuff in there,
Hmm.
and then if it's us doing it, of course, we're adding our herbal extracts. We're adding our very organic and clean sugar-free sweeteners. And as far as lecithin, you use a cold pressed sunflower lecithin that doesn't have any hexane residues in it. So we take a different
Okay.
route. But then it goes into a process called tempering, which is something not a lot of people know much about. But this is where you take the chocolate through a very precise series of temperature fluctuations because when cacao butter, when the fat in cacao solidifies, it can solidify into one of six different types of crystal formations. And based upon whether you have type 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 crystals, the melting temperature of the chocolate, its texture, and hence the way the flavor releases in your mouth is totally different. So you can have exactly the same ingredients and a different combination of crystal formation in the way the chocolate was made, and you have a totally different tasting chocolate, even though the
That is
ingredients are exactly the
fascinating.
same. Yep.
Wow, I have never ever heard of that. So how do you control that process and what type of crystallization are you looking for?
So when you make chocolate, you're trying to maximize type 5 crystals and get rid of all the other ones as much as
Hmm.
possible, or at least to minimize
Okay.
them. So there's a very specific temperatures at which you can melt away all the other ones and try to make as many type 5 as possible. And so through that process, you want to have a chocolate that is going to be solid at room temperature, have a moderate degree of room temperature stability,
Hmm.
and then you want to have a nice snap, and you want to have it melt in your mouth really nicely and have that creamy texture.
Wow. That's exactly how I would describe all of the addictive wellness chocolates because they always had a very unique mouthfeel to me, and I didn't have the language to explain it as eloquently as you just did. But that's amazing. So it's really, it's a crystal. It's essentially
Yeah, there's crystals in your
a
chocolate.
biocrystal. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. Most of the human body follows crystalline organization patterns too, even in like your mucosal membranes, your bones, obviously, ligaments, hair. So that's wild. That's really cool to know.
Yeah, and it makes a dramatic difference. And if you want to test it out yourself and see, you can take a chocolate bar, let it come up to a room temperature of about 80 degrees,
Hmm.
then cool it off back to a regular like like a say 70 degrees. It's going to be horrible because you've lost those crystals, and a more random crystallization will have formed, even though the bar didn't even melt. And you're going to have a chocolate suddenly that's now dry and way more bitter. Doesn't feel good in the mouth. Takes a long time to melt in your mouth, and
Hmm.
so that's why chocolate it's a pain sometimes because we have to be so careful in the transport of it to make sure it stays cool and arrives to people without getting too
Yeah.
warm, especially in the summertime. But it's all worth it for that perfect experience.
That experiment you just described, that's happened to me before. Is I've had chocolate bars. Usually if I don't have access to addictive wellness, my next best choice is usually Alter Eco. I'm sure you have some opinions on that. But I really like their chocolate, and I've had it start to melt before and then it re-cooled, and I went to eat it and it tasted terrible. Like it seemed like it had gone bad. And my theory was that it was absorbing maybe some of the foil from the packaging or something, but it probably formed different types
Just
of
a
crystals,
change in
right?
the crystals. And what you can do if you have that happen with a chocolate bar,
Hmm.
you're not going to have a temporary machine at home to be able to, precisely get it back to being the perfect bar it was before, but you
Hmm.
can melt it down and then pour it over something as like a chocolate syrup type dessert. It'll taste
Sure.
amazing all over again.
Okay.
Or you can melt it down and put it on a plate in the refrigerator and
Hmm.
then eat it straight out of the refrigerator, and it'll be nice like that again as well.
Okay. So it's the extra low temperature is what creates that.
Yes and no. I
Type
mean,
5.
when it goes back into the refrigerator,
Hmm.
it's not going to have that same shelf stability again. So now
Okay.
it will be dependent on cold temperatures to stay good.
Hmm.
Like if you
Okay.
bring it out and leave it out for a while, it's going to melt. It won't be good. But you can then eat it straight out of the fridge and it will be still good.
Okay. Cool. Chocolate science, folks. Very exciting.